Hello, my name is Amitha Sabbani. I'm the founder of NeuroVista, and today we're going to be going over classical conditioning. This will be part one of two videos on conditioning in general. So, what is classical conditioning? That's when you or another living organism associates an involuntary response with a stimulus. This originated from Ivan Pavlov's experiment, which involved a dog, its salivation, dog food, and a bell. That sounds like a lot of random objects mixed together, but we'll get into that in a second. Now, this looks like a lot of vocabulary to the side. However, don't worry, I will lead you through this and you'll understand it by the end. So, starting off with an unconditioned stimulus. That is a stimulus, and if you don't know, a stimulus is something that evokes a reaction or an emotion or some kind of feeling from you. So, an unconditioned stimulus would be a stimulus that automatically triggers a response without prior learning. You don't need prior exposure to this to learn this. It's kind of something that's built in. It's kind of inherent of an ability that you have. So, for an example, it could be the smell of an onion or hearing a loud thud. And kind of going hand in hand with an unconditioned stimulus would be an unconditioned response, an automatic or instinctive response that basically has no prior experience needed for it. So, kind of like an unconditioned stimulus, both of these don't need much experience before. You don't need to be exposed to it before to learn this. It's not something that you learn, it's something that you're just born with. So, they're both more instinctive. So if we go back to our example of the smell of an onion, the unconditioned response would be to start crying or to start tearing up. And if you hear a loud thud, which would be our unconditioned stimulus, our unconditioned response would be to be alarmed or worried or some kind of shock. In this case, in Ivan Pavlov's experiment, we had the dog salivate. That's their unconditioned response to the unconditioned stimulus, which is the aroma or the smell of the dog food. So these are things that are just built in us. If we smell some food, we immediately have the response of, what is it? We're kind of just brought to our senses because of that. So next, we have a neutral stimulus and no response. So neutral stimulus is something that doesn't automatically cause a response. For example, you could have the sound of a fan when there isn't a breeze. And the result of a neutral stimulus would be no response. So if you hear the sound of a fan and there's no breeze, you're not going to really be alarmed by it, but after a bit you might feel that it's going to get a little cold because the air is circulating all around the room. And so it's kind of going to be a little bit of a delay. It's not automatic of a response. In Ivan Pavlov's experiment, and he didn't use exactly a whistle, he used a bell, but this kind of brings the same idea of a sound. So when the bell, or in this case it's the whistle, when that's blown into or when that's struck as a bell, the dog doesn't have an automatic response of perking its ears up. And this could possibly be because it was in an environment where maybe making loud noises was frequent, which was the case in this experiment. Then we have the conditioned stimulus, which is a neutral stimulus, but this one has been associated or learned to be associated with a specific response through repeated exposure. The conditioned response, however, that's your reaction to this learned or picked up stimulus that basically happened through repeated exposure. So, during conditioning, what happened in Ivan Pavlov's experiment was they blowed into the whistle, and that basically kind of alarmed the dog that food was coming. So, during conditioning in the experiment, every time the whistle was blown into, the dog would start to have the unconditioned response of salivating because of the dog food, which was the unconditioned stimulus. However, after this happened repeatedly for days, the dog actually learned to salivate just because the whistle was blown into, just because of that loud sound. It associated that loud sound with the coming of its food. And so it actually thought that it had to salivate because it planned for the food to come in. However, if this didn't happen, it would just kind of have this conditioned response, because the conditioned stimulus in this case would be the whistle. The food was kind of its expectation, but that wasn't something that would evoke that salivation. So what we did was we transferred the stimulus from the dog food to the whistle through this repeated exposure, which is something that's really cool about conditioned stimuluses and conditioned stimuli and conditioned responses. So some examples that you might see in real life is maybe flashing lights, or that could kind of relate to a police car. Any kind of flashing lights could kind of evoke some kind of fear in you. But if you see specifically a police car, that's more of a conditioned stimulus. It's not something that you're born with when you're a baby, you don't really know what the police are. So it's not something that's inherent. It's something that you learn to be fearful of because that kind of alarms you. That's something that means that something serious is going on. Another thing is you may associate a certain food, person, or activity with a positive or negative response. If you love soccer, you're not going to be able to know that as a baby, but as you grow up, if you learn to love soccer, that's kind of going to be your conditioned stimulus. Now, going back to this, if you have the conditioned stimulus of the smell of a dentist's office, if you keep on going to the dentist ever since you were little and you learn to be afraid of them, you might actually be able to pick up that smell, kind of identify it, and so your conditioned response, which would be learned through your repeated exposure at the dentist's office, could be that the smell that you smell at the office could kind of evoke some kind of fear in you or some kind of alarm that kind of keeps you on your feet. Okay, so here are some closing remarks. Remember that NeuroVista is open to all high schoolers and above. The positions open are a researcher, editor, event coordinator, social media manager, a YouTube content creator, which will be on this channel, and a podcast content creator, which will be over on Spotify. The links to the descriptions and applications to those will be on the description below. And as always, please do comment down below if there's any suggestions or recommendations of what you'd like to see next on this channel. And that's pretty much it for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.